Good evening, everyone. I'm Adam Goodheart, and I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation with filmmakers George Burroughs and Lauren Giordano, and narrator Tony Cohen. You're not wearing your neckerchief, though, Tony. That was so natty in the film. Yeah, exactly. You're looking very distinguished, however. And first of all, congratulations to all of you for just a gorgeous film. I've actually got open here a chat of all of the approximately 1,000 people apparently who are watching and listening online, and just the congratulations are pouring in already. So I just thought that we could start, and I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then I'll start taking some of these questions that are coming from our online audience. So I just thought I would start by asking, how did this film come to be?
We were working on a project about trees at Adkins, and working with Jenna Tiernan, the executive director, and she was thinking about what they do to build upon their Underground Railroad programming they already have.
Right.
And so we started to take a look at a big file they had of past programming and thinking about, what would be a good asset for the Arboretum. Would it be a website with a film embedded into it? And that's kind of where we went.
Okay.
And also, Tony was in that file. He had done a past tour, and we called him, and within a minute of being on the phone with him, we're like, this is how this will happen. It's going to be a guided experience with Tony. And on that phone call, he was taking us on a guided experience immediately. That happened here.
So it didn't take too much arm twisting, Tony?
No.
Well, what was it that excited you about this project specifically?
Well, I guess first of all, as a historian, my field of expertise is historical interpretation. Mm-hmm. And so I look at objects and try to figure out what is the intrinsic story that an object or a place or an old building has to tell, and then bring that story to the present. And an entire arboretum, 400 plus acres, and two amazing filmmakers. So it was irresistible. I had to do the project.
Well, as you know, I'm a historian myself of the 19th century and cover some of this ground, and I spend a lot of my time peering at 19th century books and manuscripts and newspapers, and we historians don't always get outdoors enough. Should we think of the... Oh, come on, Tony. I thought you were the ones who did. But you were one of the ones who did. But should history nerds like me and you be thinking more about the landscape itself as a text that we can read?
Absolutely. The stories are there, and when you go to a place where history happened, you see it in a different way. Information emerges that you can't find on the written page or even between the lines, so to speak. So going to the places where history happens, I think, is critical for historians of the 21st century. And also speaking to and collaborating with people across fields. The work we do as historians, writing, lecturing, a lot of that is two-dimensional. You pair that with visual artists, then the walls start breaking down and pushing through, and then you put it in a place where there's generations of experience going on, and it just tells a story that has either never been told or has never been told in the format that you're creating and co-creating.
Was there a moment for all of you or any of you when you were out there and it was just sort of an aha moment when, I find this sometimes as a historian, you're sort of looking for history and suddenly, bang, you're in it. You're not just thinking it, but you're feeling it. And did that happen for you at all with this? Any particular moments?
Yeah, so when we were talking with Tony about how to determine which accounts to include in this piece, his kind of mantra for interpretation is start with the resource, and that was Adkins. So when we were actually then finding the resources that freedom seekers were using. There's this big, beautiful sweet gum with a tree hollow. So you can physically imagine what it would be like to try and step inside that tree and take shelter. And you're seeing the animals that they saw, you're seeing the fruits that they may have eaten. So it's a very kind of visceral experience.
It's very inescapable when you're out there. Like if you're next to that hollow and you could see the size of a Tony standing next to it, just imagine spending the night in that. And, you know, the biodiversity is not the same as it was back then. And we did those astrological shots, the astronomy shots at night. And the Arboretum is very much alive and very loud. And imagine spending the night with creatures you don't even know or understand where they're running around you, but they're there and they see you.
Yeah, for me, there were a number of moments, but to piggyback on the tulip tree with the big hollow, there was a woodcut in a book called The Underground Railroad by William Still, who was a station master in Philadelphia. And for nearly a decade, from about 1850 to about 1861 or so, he kept a ledger of all the people who were coming through his station and where they had come from, what prompted them to escape slavery. It was really revolutionary, and it was very dangerous because it was a blueprint to how the Underground Railroad operated. And then after the war, he publishes this as a history to kind of honor the history of the abolitionist society that funded these operations. But he has all the different stories, and he had the story of Leonard Grimes, along with woodcuts depicting these scenes from Grimes's experience. And so one is of Grimes, you know, kindling a fire. And then the other is of Grimes standing in the hollow of the tulip tree with an axe, battling what Still called a poplar snake for possession of the treehouse.
Wow.
And I've seen this a dozen times, and you know, it even worked its way into here. It's like, we just have to find a hollow tree. Well, Adkins does hollow trees and poplar trees. So I remember we're looking for the right one, and you know, the big one I'm standing next to is there, and George is like getting a shot from here, and then he's like getting my good side here, and he's, you know, we're working around the tree, and he's like, all right, now stand inside of it. And I'm like, I don't have an axe, and I don't want a snake dropping on me. And it just became real so instantly. And part of the realness was, you know, our pampered existence today.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's one thing to kind of, you know, tap into or get a whiff or an aroma of the past, but the closer you get to it, it often brings pause, right?
And, you know, I've done some camping in my life, and I go out there and I've got, you know, my synthetic fabrics insulating me and my nice hiking boots, and I've got a flashlight and all of that stuff. And, you know, I still have a hard enough time struggling my way through the woods for a night or two of a camping trip. But when you think that these people were not only out there for months and months, but also, can you talk about sort of what clothes would they have been wearing? What supplies would they have been carrying with them through this wilderness?
Well, that's interesting because we know a lot about, you know, clothing on the Underground Railroad from runaway slave notices of the time. Mm-hmm. So when someone would escape, their owner or an agent for their owner would put in a description, you know, in a newspaper, their height, their physical appearances, any scars that were on them, where they thought they might be going to, and what they were wearing. Mm. In the case of Harriet Tubman, I believe nothing was mentioned in terms of clothing. But I've seen runaway ads where owners, claim their enslaved people were escaping with steamer trunks full of clothes. Got to look good when you get to freedom, right? But sometimes it was, people were escaping almost instantaneously because they just discovered that their master had died, and now the estate was up to be settled, which meant selling off your human assets first. And so, boom, you're on the road. No game plan, no map, no plan B or C, and literally the clothes on your back. Sometimes those clothes weren't very good anyway, so they were falling off of you as you ran. Others prepared sometimes months and years for it. And if they weren't traveling in style, they were well prepared. So it was really the gamut. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, there was, when we were going through the accounts, Charles Ball, his account has quite a few descriptions of the clothing that he had and how it was getting torn by the briars. And I think at one point he may have made kind of like shoes out of bark, tree bark. So that's kind of...
And Charles Ball is an interesting account because he was in Maryland, in Calvert County at Patterson, Jefferson Park, and then he sold south. And as he got, right when he got, knowing on the way, going down south, he knew he was coming back, and he saved up and planned, and he actually saved some meat. He was an accomplished hunter, and right when the time was right, and he felt confident, he was on his way back north.
And I know enslaved people would often escape right at the end of the year because that week between Christmas and New Year's was a week that often they were given a sort of a vacation of sorts, and not necessarily for altruistic reasons, but also because that was often when the masters were negotiating a new contract to hire them out for the year ahead. But when you think that, that time was a typical moment that they would set out into the woods in the coldest, snowiest season of the year without knowing what the weather forecast was going to be. That footage that you used that showed the woods at different seasons, I thought was very powerful.
Yeah, I think that's something that's, like, for me, the most arresting. I mean, on the one hand, these are people who lived on the land. These were people who, even on the farms and plantations and row homes and towns and villages where they lived, might be in a stable, might be in the loft of an outbuilding with insufficient heat, and they were acclimated to all sorts of harsh conditions. I think for me, I step out to the cold and I'm like, oh, it's cold, I'm running to my car, I'm running back in the house, whatever. And so we may even have, as we're trying to get a sense of their experience, a false experience of what their experience was. My mom's from East Texas, and we have like a lot of country cousins, right? who we would visit, and they would be out without shoes everywhere. Prickly pear. I mean, East Texas is brutal. Prickly pear, all sorts of things that are going to stick in you and stick to you, right? Didn't affect them at all. So the world that we try to see through their eyes might not, and is likely not, the full picture.
Interesting. And, I think one thing also that people don't always think about with the Underground Railroad, everybody imagines somebody sort of picking up, in South Carolina, in Maryland, wherever they are, and just heading north to cross the Mason-Dixon line to freedom. But a lot of enslaved people would escape into the forests and fields while they were enslaved, and then actually come back, wouldn't they? And so it was almost like you got these sort of practice runs. Did that happen more than those stories of people just heading north hundreds of miles? And was that a way that people acclimated themselves, or literally and metaphorically, to that experience of escaping?
There's a couple examples that we came across, or accounts. Harry Grimes is one of them. He would just go into the woods and he would live for like 7 months and then go back. There is an account, was it Mississippi? The one that we did not include, but we put on the website.
Uncle Lewis.
Uncle Lewis, yeah. He was, the account is that he, and this wasn't, the reason why we didn't use it, it wasn't a first-hand account. It was a member of the enslaving family that wrote the account. And he would build, it was said that he would build kind of like a tree house.
Platform.
Yeah, platform. And he would live in that for a while to go clear his head. And then he would come back to the plantation.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That whole negotiation and ways in which enslaved people were able to assert their power and their freedom, even while enslaved and even without liberating themselves, is just, or seeking freedom in the North, is just so fascinating. Well, I want to get to some of these questions that are coming in, but I'll ask you one last question first, which is, there are a lot of places that people escaped from. There are a lot of parks in the United States, and why tell the story at Adkins, or why tell the story in this area? We all know about Harriet Tubman, of course. We know about Frederick Douglass, although he didn't escape through this landscape. Of course, he escaped very differently. But why here?
Well, Atkins is an arboretum. They actually, well, you could talk about the flora.
Well, one of the main reasons why it was such an excellent fit was proximity. It was in an area where there was a lot of activity during that time, but also because of the preservation and the restoration of the landscape, what you're seeing is similar to what you have seen then. And because of the diversity of areas, you have meadow, you have forest, you have swamps, you have wetlands, you can see it all in one place. So you can we were able to tell so many different stories from so many different places in this one place. So it's an amazing resource to come and learn about so many different things in kind of one visit, or hopefully multiple visits.
And the Arboretum's geography is pretty interesting, that it's just, let me see now. Okay. It's just a couple miles north on the Tuckahoe from where Frederick Douglass was born.
Right.
And then known routes for Harriet Tubman were just to the southeast. And the Starr Center also has come across an account of a mother with a baby, not far from the Arboretum, that made her flight to freedom on her own to Philadelphia.
Yeah, I'm involved, as you know, with a project at Washington College called Chesapeake Heartland. And the idea of Chesapeake Heartland is we're kind of investigating whether this area of the country, this area of the Chesapeake region, is a sort of a heartland of African American history, where it stretches back across 4 centuries, and everything from the first arrival of the Africans in the 1600s up through the Freedom Riders who came through here in the 60s and beyond. So yeah, we've been looking for documents and accounts, and we found this story that you're referencing of a woman named Bina, and she was escaping from right near here with her 15-month-old child, and they made it to Philadelphia. And when you think about what it must have taken to go through this landscape with a 15-month-old child, and we know that she was being pursued as well, I mean, these people were incredibly, incredibly motivated and brave, weren't they?
They were, and gosh, Bina's story is at the same time incredibly inspirational and incredibly heartbreaking, heartrending, because you just wonder about a world where that is a reality. It's insane. But also, to your question about why Atkins, I would say part of the answer is why now? Adkins because Adkins is there. Adkins because, and this is a little weird idea, but I'm going to float it. I kind of believe that history asserts itself at those points in time when people are ready to hear and absorb its meaning. And what a powerful what a powerful time we are in now. I live across the bay, and I don't know why I'm getting emotional, but this has been really intense past few years when it comes to race and race relations. Across the bay, almost every town and city of any size has had one or more Black Lives Matters marches or incidents of brutality that has sparked those kind of protests.
And even over here we have.
And even over here. But someplace like Adkins, which is, far from the madding crowd, as they say, and, strikes a different note in time and space, has a story, a contribution to this big story that our country is struggling to tell. I don't think there could have been a better place to do it. So grateful. So grateful.
What a beautiful answer. And with that, I'll turn to some of the questions that people are asking. So let's see. Someone has asked, this is a terrific question. This is Jerry Kickinson, says, I assume the greatest fear was not animals in the forest or swamp, but humans and slave hunters. Is that true? And can you tell us more about the pursuers who were chasing these people? Was it simply that their master would sort of go out after them and chase them for a few miles and then turn around, or what?
I would say it was both. There's a lot of danger and hazard. There's exposure. There's a lot of things that can go wrong when you're on your own. I mean, just read the news. How many people just go for a morning hike and then that's it, right? But I think the scary thing is the bounty hunters are extremely dangerous and terrifying because they're in it for one thing, money. Mm-hmm. They thought of it just as money. And some of the bounties that were put out were very enticing at the time.
Yeah, and I guess with the natural world, to a great degree, enslaved people had to negotiate that every day. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess they did the brutality of enslavers and bounty hunters as well.
Yeah. There's a question from Carolyn and Dan Matthews. Was it common for freedom seekers to go through Delmarva specifically? And also, did they ever cross the bay? And if so, how?
Oh, yeah. They crossed the bay on boats, sometimes hitching rides, sometimes commandeering their own vessels to freedom. And also, freedom was, I don't know the right way of saying this, locational. So, the first piece of freedom was when you had the white noise of the plantation behind you. The second was maybe when you were able to stand up a little straighter and gain some confidence. You knew there was something behind you, but there was also something before you. And then after that, it was commanding the landscape. There's a fantastic account of a husband and wife out of Tennessee, and the wife had always worked in the big house, while the husband worked in the fields, and I believe he was also a mechanic, so he was very kind of worldly wise, and she was very cloistered. And she said, at first, as she went out with him, the slightest noise terrified her, and she was constantly on edge. But they just did crazy things. They were chased, and they would hide. And then after a while, they gained their confidence. And one time a man approached them on horseback and said, "You're runaways." And they're like, and he went to get reinforcements, and instead of going the other direction, they followed him because they knew that once he gathered reinforcements, he would return to where he last saw them. So yes, so they were right ahead. And there's even later an account that as they went along, they had to raid farms, dairy houses, smoke houses to gather food so they'd have enough to eat. But after a while, they realized that they didn't need to take anything. So they were laughing because instead of taking a whole pie out of a dairy house, they just take bites out of it and leave it there and laugh, thinking what was going to happen when the owners came and found big chunks, big bites taken out of the pies. I mean, it became this moving comedy. But that was the confidence that they developed on what otherwise was a perilous journey.
Incredible. We hear so many stories, and the Underground Railroad has been subject, since the 19th century to so much mythologizing and fiction. And, I think a lot of people's image is of maybe a white family, Quakers, who would be hiding enslaved people in the cellar or a secret compartment somewhere. And, how significant a part of the Underground Railroad was that? But also conversely, especially in an area like this one with a large free black community, where more than half the population was free before the Civil War. What role did that surrounding community of African Americans play in helping people to escape?
Defer to you on that one, Tony.
Oh, haven't you heard enough from me? It was significant. It was significant. Talbot, Queen Anne, Caroline, and even Dorchester. Dorchester had less Quakers than counties north to it, but they kind of laid the groundwork for something akin to abolition or anti-slavery. And the first wave of that was 18th century Quakers, who were, many of whom were landowners and slaveholders, beginning to divest themselves of their human property after the Revolutionary War. And then the next generation of that former human property is raised in this weird kind of quasi-freedom. So enslaved people who wanted to escape their situation could just look around the neighborhood and see examples of freedom, what that was like. And it wasn't that getting to the north was anything special. It was the last desperate effort for people who couldn't stay where they were. If they could negotiate a good contract with those who held them, that would have been a game changer. No one would have escaped north if they could have proven themselves and they could have kept their families here. This was their home.
Because life in the north can be incredibly difficult too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and a lot of the accounts we found, just real quickly, is that they would get to the north and find even bounty hunters going across Niagara Falls into Canada and bringing them back without staying. So, in a couple of accounts we found is Canada wasn't even enough. They would hop a boat to Greenland, all the way to Bristol, England. They wanted to just put America behind them, and I don't blame them.
Yeah, John Thompson, who is from Prince George's County, ends up in New Haven, then on a whaling vessel, went to Alaska and I believe Tahiti. Saw the world.
Wow. These stories are so much more complicated than the stereotypes are. We have a great question from Sebastian, who is 8 years old, and he asks, how did they learn to do the navigating? I mean, all this woodcraft that you depict, you don't just have that knowledge, you don't just Google it. How did they learn it?
Well, I guess it's experiential, right, Tony?
And generational.
And generational.
Yeah, and generational.
Yeah.
in Africa, people deciphered the night sky. Cultures all across the globe navigate by the sky. And if you want to talk about a stereotype, when you read the slave narratives, accounts written down or spoken to a literate a writer after the enslaved person reached freedom, so many of them reference the North Star. That was a known thing. They knew that it would lead them to a free territory.
Judith Hughes asks, can you recommend firsthand writings about freedom seekers' escape journeys? You've mentioned a few of these freedom seekers, and of course, very few of them left firsthand accounts, but are there any in particular besides the ones we know, like Frederick Douglass's narrative?
So we, on the project's website, naturesworld.org, we linked to all of the accounts that we used because the stories are so much bigger than the specifics that we included. So you can go and see all of them, and then you can also go to those sources, and there are even more. There are tons and tons of interviews and accounts that were related to other people and written.
Yeah, you'll learn a lot more when you go to the website and go through those accounts, because you'll understand kind of like when you think of Adkins and the place of how an outdoor space like that is supposed to be used. It's a place to go and reflect and to observe. And you'll find these first-hand accounts that a lot of the enslaved and freedom seekers learned by doing just that.
Right.
Okay. And I think it's a great opportunity for people to take a look at this history and then themselves reconnect with the environment. Any that you would recommend specifically, Tony?
Don't get me started.
We want you to get started.
University of North Carolina. Okay.
Documenting the American South.
Thank you.
Yes, that was a huge source for us.
Documenting the American South.
And it's a searchable database. So you can put in, slaves, berries, and, all the accounts when enslaved people mention eating berries will pop up. Yeah. The WPA slave narratives on the Library of Congress's website, though the website interface is a little wonky, so it's kind of hard to get into. The Maryland State Archives, fantastic resource called The Legacy of Slavery, and also Beneath the Underground Railroad, where they've just scoured and culled from all their documents as many references to that time period, and have digitized them and put them on. William Still's book, which is a digital download, you don't have to pay for it. And then another one I would recommend is the Ohio Historical Society has the Wilbur Siebert collection. And Siebert was a professor of European history in the 1890s who took an interest in the Underground Railroad, and for 40 years wrote letters directly to people in all different states, different counties, people who had operated the Underground Railroad or whose grandparents had, and got firsthand accounts of how they operated, who was involved. And it's one of the most kind of research Underground Railroad resources. There's also another version of it at Harvard, so
fantastic.
That'll get you started.
Thanks.
And the work at the Starr Center.
Yeah, and I suspect a lot of people may be interested in stuff from this area specifically. And one thing I would recommend, the book that you mentioned, William Still's The Underground Railroad. It's just remarkable how many of those stories are from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, people escaping from here to Philadelphia. And so if you find that book, and you can find it on that Documenting the American South website, you can find it on archive.org, and simply keyword search for the name of your town or county on the Eastern Shore, I can guarantee that you'll find sometimes just for Chestertown and Kent County, I think there are about 20 different stories within that one book. Granted, it's about 1,000 pages or so, but you get a sense like what was happening right here in my own community that I found really powerful. And another one is Isaac Mason's autobiography, which is from Kent County, and he escaped from Chestertown. The house he escaped from is still there. It's now the headquarters of the Kent Cultural Alliance. They're restoring it in Chestertown, and his story is amazingly powerful. And as you know, Marlon Saunders, a very gifted local musician descended from deep local African American roots, is making a musical that's premiering in June. Did you know about that?
Nope.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a lot going on. Tony, you've got to spend more time on the Eastern Shore, I think.
Yeah, I spend all my time in the woods, jumping over a creek.
That's good too.
What I do just want to quickly say is when you read William Still's book, which is like 800 or 900 pages, good weekend read. What strikes me is the people who emerge from this region, and most of the accounts in Still's book were people who came out of the Eastern Shore. But the impact that they made on destabilizing the system of slavery on the Eastern Shore and bulking up the abolitionist movement in the North is profound. And I'm sure there's many people here who've had the opportunity to travel to places like Birmingham and Montgomery and go along freedom trails. The Eastern Shore of Maryland had an impact on ending slavery to the magnitude, I believe, that we think of, the Deep South and all of those civil rights struggle places having on the modern civil rights era.
Wow.
And I wish someone, that scholars would start looking at it from a macro level instead of just individual people and individual escapes. What was the collective doing?
Yeah.
What did that brain power and brain trust give to our country? And in such a short time, we're really talking like a 10 to 20 year window at the height of the abolitionist movement, where all of this was happening without social media. Pretty powerful.
Yeah, when we travel around the Eastern Shore, really just about every road and waterway and field was an Underground Railroad pathway at one time or another, wasn't it? I mean, it imbued the entire landscape here. Well, I'll ask, I think we're running already a little bit over, but I'll ask one last question to all three of you, which is, what is your greatest hope for what comes out of this beautiful film that you've just made and which is going out into the world for, we hope, diverse audiences on and beyond the Eastern Shore to appreciate and learn from?
Understanding and impact.
I would hope that folks, after seeing this, maybe would go out and look at the landscape around them in a different way and think about what might have been happening and how that connects with their life today and how they can be a part of that now.
The film and website, the film is great to watch and then have a really rigorous discussion afterwards, but the website is going to live on. It will include these additional accounts that you've mentioned, and it's a great place to keep compiling this information so people can go and look at it and come back to it and see what has been added to learn more, because it's like a gap in our American history that needs to be filled in, especially now if we're going to move forward. Like, we can't change the past, but this is what we can do today for tomorrow.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a beautiful way to end our discussion. Thanks so much to the three of you. And I think we're going to hear from Jenna before the evening wraps up. Please.
Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to the National Park Service, Network to Freedom for funding Rooted Wisdom. And special thanks to Dock Street Foundation, Beth Durkin, Hugh Panero, and the Stories of the Chesapeake with their generous support to promote Rooted Wisdom. As we build upon this initiative, we welcome your feedback and your support. Please continue to watch our website, sign up for our newsletters, and most of all, come visit us. I look forward to seeing you at the Arboretum. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.